So perhaps before we come to the exact conception, which is a huge part of it, and childhood, all of those things you've said seem so associated with modern society. As you say, our society is increasingly desperate to escape isolation and dismay of our daily lives. It's rife with addiction. Consumer society is rife with addiction. We're presented with this fast moving consumer culture. There's everything there to kind of fill any void we have. So do you point the finger at that culture that we live in? You know, it drives us to be addicts of whatever form. You know, is that human nature, or is that very much exacerbated by this culture that we live in?
Well, in the book I'm currently writing, The Myth of Normal, I have a chapter on human nature. And we tend to identify human nature with our own behaviors. We're not aware that different circumstances create different human beings with a totally different nature. So this society does two things. It denies some basic human needs for meaning and for contact and for autonomy on the one hand. And on the other hand, whole industries are based on distracting ourselves from the pain that follows from that denial. And so that so much of the economy is based on distracting people from the pain of existence in this culture. Somebody wrote a book with a very astute title a couple of decades ago called When Society is an Addict. Mm. And it's exactly the point that you raised.
Mm. So do you look at society today and think that in essence we are all, it's almost impossible to live in such a society and not be an addict, because you know, how is it even possible to find that sort of normality, or whatever you would define it as, freedom in a society such as ours?
It is possible under two circumstances. One is rare, which is that you have the kind of conception, gestation, and upbringing that really keeps you connected to meaning and your true self. It happens. There are such people. More commonly, it's still possible to not to be seduced by the addictive blandishments of this culture, but it takes a high degree of consciousness and awareness. And that takes work. Believe me, talking personally, that takes a lot of work. Not that I'm a finished product by any means, but it's taken me a lot of work, and everybody that I know, to become aware and conscious, and therefore not to have to move to fill this void, as you say, automatically and compulsively. That takes, in this culture, a lot of awareness. In this culture, where so much is designed to take you away from yourself and to create false needs to fill the void that the culture itself created.
And similarly, as a culture, I mentioned at the beginning, I was sorry we couldn't be in the same room. I know that you are sorry we can't be in the same room. We can't see each other. There's a disconnectedness that no one can deny. That's obviously been exacerbated hugely by what we're all going through at the moment. So when you put those two things together, society, again, you know, there's sort of an isolated society now exacerbated by the coronavirus, which keeps us all in our own homes. We're not able to see people. How much of a devastating effect does that have on increasing illness, of course, and addiction?
Well, as you in Britain might know, the loneliness epidemic, they call it. It's interesting how we put everything in disease terms, but the loneliness epidemic has got to the point where your government has appointed a minister of loneliness. A minister of loneliness. That's before COVID. And with the increasing isolation that COVID has imposed, we've seen an increase in drug use and in domestic violence, babies being battered, all the traumas that later on will then further lead to addiction.
Do you talk about babies being battered and those sorts of traumas, as you refer to a lot in the book, as you've referred to already in this talk, support for parents, support for parenting, and just generally the importance of the childhood experience is, of course, central to everything that you talk of. And again, do you see that as something that society now is not as good as at promoting as it once was? So, you know, you talk about past days when we were part of communities and tribes and parenting was something very different. And that is perhaps the most important root of an increased population of addicts, as you say.
Well, if we just look at, if you had a garden, if you had an English country garden, and you were cultivating it and growing plants, and some of these plants weren't growing well, and they were kind of scrawny and misshapen, you could accuse them of being derelict and yell at them to grow up already. Or you could say, what conditions are lacking here? Nutrition, sunlight, irrigation, so on, space, and so on. In our society, we see increasing number of people being addicted, being depressed, increasing number of children being anxious, being diagnosed with all manner of so-called medical conditions like ADHD and so on, which I've also written about. But instead of asking ourselves, well, what's wrong with the conditions that these children are developing in, we're actually pathologizing these kids and saying they have a disease of some kind. Now let's look at the environment. If you look at how human beings evolved, how we actually evolved, we evolved as communal creatures. We could not have evolved otherwise. So before there were our species walked the earth, there were pre-humans or other humans and their ancestors. And so for millions, hundreds of thousands of years, and for most of the existence of our own species, which seemed to arise about 150, 200,000 years ago, we lived in small band hunter-gatherer groups where children were surrounded by many adults who parented them as their own kids. So there was what's called allo-parenting, where others would also parent each child. Not a question of each nuclear family separated in their own little cave, and then a baby had its own cave, can you imagine? Or its own little hut. No, kids were always together with adults. They were picked up and held all the time. When Aboriginal peoples are studied in small band hunter-gatherer groups, which is how we lived for most of our existence, kids are not left to cry on their own. They're picked up all the time. They're not hit. And parents have all this support from the whole clan and the whole tribe. And you don't have to think that far back. I mean, think of the English village. You have much of the same dynamic not that long ago. And in some places, you still have it, increasingly rare. But this idea of the nuclear family, or even an isolated mother or father living in a bungalow or an apartment with the kids, separated from extended family, separated from community, it's a modern concoction. It's got deleterious consequences, which is that the stress on parents has become way too much. And stresses on parents from in utero onwards affect the biology, including the brain biology of the child. So the more stressed people are economically and because of isolation and all the travails of modern life, the more stressed their kids are going to be. And that's going to show up in all these so-called diseases that children are now suffering from, where really what's going on, and this is saliently true of the addict, is that the circumstances required for healthy development were just not there. And that has an impact on psychology, on brain physiology, and a person's very sense of themselves and their sense of belonging in the world. So that's what's happened. And so for all our incredible technological and scientific, intellectual advances, we've lost something very precious that we don't need to give up, but we have to become conscious of what we've lost in order to get it back.
But when you talk in such terms, quite categoric terms of addiction, let's take that illness, or let's take that sort of as our starting point. All addiction, you say, originates in trauma from childhood experience. Does that categorically mean, is that categorically so? So there isn't the idea that events in later life could turn an otherwise happy child who grew up in a loved and supported household into an addict? Or has your research shown you that really it is a categoric thing, that those suffering from addiction grew up in a traumatic childhood?
Yeah, well, that's again a multi-layered issue, but let's take the example of Vietnam veterans, American soldiers who were sent to that horrible war in Vietnam. And about 20% of them, with the free access to opiates, became regular heroin users. But when they came back, most of them gave up the heroin. The people that didn't, so in other words, under the stress of that terrible situation, many of them began to soothe themselves with heroin. But once they came back and they had left that stress behind, most of them quite readily gave up their heroin. The people that didn't were the ones that had been traumatized in childhood. So while it's true that extreme stress in adulthood can impose escaping behaviors, the people that really become mired in addiction are the ones that were traumatized in childhood. And there's, I could say hundreds of research endeavors showing that to be the case. It's not even controversial. In fact, it is controversial only because people don't look at the research. No, and one more point, Hannah. This is difficult. I can't demonstrate this now, but a lot of people think they had a happy childhood. And when I give my talks, I'll say, I'll issue what I call the Happy Childhood Challenge, which is, okay, you've had an addiction, you've had a mental health issue, you've had an illness, and you think you had a happy childhood. Tell me about it. It takes 3 minutes, just by asking a few questions, for that person to recognize that they, in fact, they had a lot of pain in their childhood that they blocked out. Because one way that children survive pain is to block it out. And it's not difficult to get to the root of that. I don't mean to talk people into anything. You just ask them a few questions. So in my new book, again, I talk about the myth of the happy childhood, which does exist for some people, but not nearly as many who think so.
So yes, I know that to be the case. I was listening earlier to a podcast you did after, I think, a How To Academy event when you were in London not so long ago, to which exactly what you say just happened. Someone put up their hand and was very sure they had a happy, positive childhood. And I think it took you about a minute to sort of dismantle that notion, and it wasn't in fact the case. But I mean, it's really interesting to me in the book when you write about this idea that you're not blaming parents. Somebody I know said, I can't come to this talk, my child went through addictions and I can't face this idea that it was my fault, that I did something wrong. I can't think what that was. I don't want to be blamed. So it's interesting to me you distinguish between blame and responsibility. Perhaps it's a very fine line. Perhaps you could explain that.
Yeah, well, I can tell you that one of the most surprising impacts of my book in the realm of hunger ghosts is I get strangers coming up to me in the street. It's happened more than once, or contact me by email and saying, my child died of an overdose. And thanks to your book, I now understand what happened. Which is extraordinary, because I'm actually saying that the adult child who died of an overdose, their problems began in their childhood, in a family of origin. But there's no fault here. When that person says, I don't want to be faulted or blamed, That's their projection. That's their formulation. That's not what I say, think, believe, or intend to communicate. Let me give you a personal example. I talked about my workaholism, which meant that I was really alive and vital and happy when I was working. At home, I'd be depressed and irritable. Now, why was that the case? As people have heard me say this elsewhere, as a Jewish infant under Nazi occupation, and I'm not going to go in Hungary, I'm not going to go into the whole story now, but I really got the message that the world didn't want me. And that came through my mother, because my mother was depressed and grief-struck by the death of her parents in Auschwitz and terrified for her own existence. Infants take that stuff personally. And when she gave me to a stranger and I didn't see her for 6 weeks to save my life, I get the message that I'm not lovable, I'm not wanted. Well, folks, I'll tell you a secret. If you get the message that you're not wanted and not lovable, go to medical school, because then they're going to want you and love you all the time. When they're being born, when they're dying, and every moment in between. So 20 times a day, you get the message, oh, you're really important. Great. So I become a workaholic because I'm trying to fill that void from the outside through the work. What message do my kids get when daddy's not around all the time? And when he's around, he's irritable and depressed. The same message. Am I blaming myself? Well, I've had to work my way through a lot of guilt about that. Believe me, I understand that. But am I really blaming myself? Did I do it deliberately? Did I wake up one morning and say, how am I going to screw up my kids? No, I was just acting out my own trauma. So this is multi-generational. As a recent book says, it didn't begin with you. It's multi-generational. There's nobody to be blamed. Nobody does it deliberately. No parent is blamed. It's unscientific, inappropriate, and cruel to blame parents. I don't blame parents and I don't blame myself. But realistically, if I want to understand the struggles of my now adult kids, I have to look at, well, what was their childhood like? And I was there. I know what it was like. So there's no blame here. And we have to approach everything with compassion, including for the parents who, for no fault of their own, passed on that trauma to their children. And a major example of that here in Canada is our First Nations community, our indigenous people. Indigenous people make up 4 or 5% of the Canadian population. They made up 30% of my clients in the downtown east side, and they make up 30% of the jail population in this country. Now, those people until 100 years ago, 150 years ago, knew how to parent much better than we do today. What happened? Colonization, deprivation of lands, livelihood, meaning in their spiritual ways, the robbery of their culture, and the forced separation of children from their parents, generation after generation, in these abusive residential schools. And now guess what? People that never knew addiction, all of a sudden, high addiction rates, high suicide rates, high mental health rates. Am I blaming those parents? No, I'm just talking about history. And that history affects all of us. So there's no blame here. And so anybody listening to me who feels that parental guilt, just ask yourself, what morning did you wake up and decide to mess up your kids? Is that what you did? Or did you just live your life the best way you knew how, given how you were shaped by your own life circumstances from conception onwards?